Ukraine has been standing upright against Russian invasion for about 10 months with the help of the USA and the West. So far, the Russian army has bombarded Kiev and many other Ukrainian cities. In the process, many innocent Ukrainian citizens lost their lives. The heroic Ukrainian army of Kiev put a stop to this aggressive attitude of the invading troops, and Zelensky's brave soldiers began to fall like lightning on the Russian troops switching from a defensive position to an offensive position. The soldiers of Moscow, who were surprised at what they had been through, could not fully understand how this time period passed. Ukraine suddenly had the upper hand against the Russians and recaptured many of their homeland from the occupying troops. Vladimir Putin did not even think that the Ukrainians would be so resilient, so determined, and so fond of their freedom. At the beginning of the war, Putin stated that the siege of Kiev would take 2 hours, but right now his army is melting away on Ukrainian soil. The Kremlin administration and Putin decided to mobilize across the country in the face of this advance of the Ukrainian army. The Russian leader perhaps thought of rallying his army and compensating for his losses with this method. However, the decision to mobilize throughout Russia sank the Moscow army to the bottom. Thousands of Russian soldiers and officers who do not want to fight on Ukrainian soil at the moment have come to the point of going completely crazy with the mobilization decision. Every day, newly mobilized Russian citizens were dying one by one on the Ukrainian fronts. This situation seriously damaged the morale of the soldiers in the Russian army. The hopes of the Moscow army to win this war were now fading. Every day, the news of Russian soldiers fleeing the front was on the agenda. Or we have repeatedly come across videos of mobilized Russian citizens being tortured by their commanders in Russian bases. An application initiated by the Ukrainian armed forces was seen as a remedy for all this plight of the Russian soldiers. Thousands of Russian soldiers surrendered with the encouragement and campaign of the Ukrainian army. We came across many Russian detachments, units, and groups that surrendered en masse in the Russian army. However, with the Ukraine campaign launched in September, more than 3,500 Russian soldiers applied to the Ukrainian army to surrender in less than 2 months. The I Want to Leave service is gained a lot of attention as a hotline where Russian-occupied Russians and Ukrainians can inform Kiev that they do not want to participate in the occupation of the Moscow administration and can arrange a surrender. According to a Ukrainian official, more than 3,500 soldiers who were preparing for Russia's war in Ukraine contacted the line called I Want to Live and reported that they wanted to surrender. These shocking figures were reached in a very short time. This service, run both over the phone and telegram, was launched 2 days before Putin announced the mass mobilization of the reserve forces on September 21. Project spokesman Vitaly Matvienko stated that an interview that this incident caused a storm of investigations in Russia. The Russian Prosecutor General's office blocked the site in mid-October and claimed to have received more than 2,000 inquiries so far. However, this blocking decision did not completely prevent Russians from accessing the site. Since the decision was taken, many Russian citizens or Russian soldiers who fought on the territory of Ukraine called this line and declared that they wanted to surrender. How people in Russia continued to access the service remained unclear, but explaining the process, Matvienko explained that before the Russians are mobilized, they can reach through a chatbot and fill out questionnaire that is considered pre-submitted and then stored in a database. Matvienko announced that when Russian soldiers reached Ukraine, they called the hotline again, upon which their information was withdrawn and arrangements for surrender began. Matvienko noted that most of the investigations opened by the Russian Attorney General's office initially came from Russia, but they were also seen in the occupied territories in Ukraine, on the front lines of the war, and in Belarus. Within the scope of the I Want to Live process, the Ukrainian administration shared that it guarantees all rights of prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, including food, home phone, calls, and medical care. The Russian administration, on the other hand, decided to pursue a threatening policy in order to keep its citizens away from this line within the scope of this process. The Kremlin under Vladimir Putin declared that the Russians who sought this line of surrender of the Ukrainian armed forces were traitors. The Russian leader was risking the lives of his citizens for the sake of his own reputation, but Russian soldiers and local people did not listen to these blackmail strategies of Vladimir Putin and continued to call this line. The figure of 3,500, which was reached in a very short time, is said to reach hundreds of thousands with the density of those calling the line. This oppressive attitude of Russia causes more Moscow army soldiers to seek the surrender line of the Ukrainian armed forces. Especially after the mobilization decision, the Russian soldiers increased their search for a solution due to the disagreements within the army. In fact, these research of the Russians were nothing more than a plea. The reason for this was the Moscow administration could no longer meet the basic needs of this newly mobilized citizens. Most of the Russian soldiers met their own needs and were trying to survive in Russian bases under very difficult conditions. After a certain period of time, these soldiers who were mobilized into the Moscow army became unable to meet their own needs because the Russian administration had not paid the salaries of these soldiers for a long time, and these soldiers were fighting on the Ukrainian fronts without a penny. Russian leader Vladimir Putin was aware of all these negativities, but his only goal was to supply the Moscow army with more and more new soldiers. Disregarding the lives of thousands of citizens for this cause, Putin was finding new victims for his army who could die on the battlefield every day. The Russian leader also signed a decree in increasing the prison sentence for those who fled the country after declaring partial mobilization. A draft law has been prepared to implement prison sentences for those who do not comply with the partial mobilization decision due to the density experienced at airports and at the borders of neighboring countries. The law passed in the Russian parliament was approved by the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Russians who do not surrender to their troops can face up to 10 years in prison. In addition, it was decided to impose heavy fines on those who repeat this crime. Those who commit this crime for the first time can face fines of between $17,000 and $50,000. Those who repeat this crime will be sentenced to 8 to 10 years in prison. With another decree signed by Putin, the process of obtaining Russian citizenship for foreign citizens who have served in the Russian army under a contract for more than 1 year has been facilitated. The bills in question were approved last week by the Duma, the lower house of Russian parliament, and then by the Federation Council. While the effects of this oppressive rule of Vladimir Putin continue all over Russia, the traces of the Ukrainian heroes' latest Kherson victory are slowly emerging. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky claimed that Russian forces committed more than 400 war crimes while withdrawing from the city of Kherson. According to Ukraine, Russia has committed at least 34,000 war crimes since February. According to the International Committee of the Red Cross, even war has rules. These rules are set out in the Geneva Conventions and other international laws and agreements. Military forces cannot knowingly attack civilians, nor can they attack infrastructure necessary for civilian survival. Chemical or biological weapons are also among the weapons that are forbidden to be used during war, as they cause excessive and deep pain. The wounded and sick must be treated, including wounded soldiers who are entitled to be prisoners of war. Serious crimes such as murder, rape, mass torture, or genocide, which fall under the category of crimes against humanity, should not be committed. Ukrainian leader Zelensky cites the discovery of civilian bodies as an example of Russia's war crimes in Kherson. Ukrainians living in Kherson tell reporters that Russia is killing and abducting civilians. Russia denies allegations that its soldiers deliberately targeted civilians. During the war, we will see together whether any judicial action will be taken on this issue and how these human rights violations will be handled in international courts. Please do not forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications in order to be informed about new videos. Thank you for watching us.